Anybody who's a gun owner that thinks that we don't have a gun problem in this country is sticking their head in the sand. So you can get a concealed handgun license in 4 to 6 hours. Seriously, this is very serious. But you to get to a beauty license or a barber license, it takes a year at least. Certain like 100 hours of school. Now, how did we get to that? And the thing is, I am pro-gun, but I'm anti-NRA, the National Rifle Association. They are the enemy. They are one of the most powerful lobbying forces in this country, and they're shit. They're not. I mean, like they supposedly say that they're an advocacy organization, but they aren't. And what they have done for the last 40 years, have sold 50 years, has sold this idea that guns are tied to a man, a white man generally, protecting himself and his quote unquote family, as if nobody else has agency in their own lives. Just because you're pro gun or that I say that people should own guns doesn't mean that I fall into that category that undeniably that people should have guns for any reason anywhere. Like I have often made the very simple analysis that guns are a tool, just like a shovel. And shovels can do wonderful, amazing things, so can guns, but they also can kill people, right? But I don't carry a shovel with me everywhere I go just in case I need it, right? Right? I don't, and so why would I carry a gun around everywhere just in case I need it? I can tell you in the 51 years I've been on this planet, I've only needed a gun about 5 or 6 times where I thought my life was being threatened, like really threatened, not an existential threat. And so I think that until we begin to have nuanced conversations, that we're going to be stuck in that binary, which the NRA wants, of like pro-gun, anti-gun, and which Republicans and Democrats, elected, people who hold power, they all want that because it makes it easy for them. And guess who's driving their agendas? Of course, it's lobbyists of different kinds, whether it's the Brady handgun people on one side or the other. And these are multi-million dollar organizations making a ton of money.
Is it a matter of the kind of guns that we allow people to have, or is it just a matter of education with any type of guns?
So really, it's a culture shift. We need to shift culture. The alienation in this culture is creating, and alienation doesn't just come from capitalism and economic systems. It's everything that's in here, everything that makes us all feel less connected to each other because we are connected. We're not actually having communities anymore. We're having these overlapping networks of people and doing things. So there's a sense of alienation that people are there. But I think that there's culture shifts that need to happen because we need to ask ourselves, why are people struggling with depression? Why are people struggling with alienation? Because we try to pull it off to say it's one person, it's just this person, or it's just that person. But we run into hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people who feel this alienation. And then within that culture, I think also we need to think about that even though quote unquote leftist culture is supposedly open ended and we want collective liberation for people or reform or whatever it is that people on the left are doing. But the thing is, there's a subcultural language that dominates on this that people benefit from that is alienating to those outside of it. And as a white man who's often gets like broadsworded with everything else, I could see I can stand up and go like, I know that's not who I am, and I have a sense of self about that. But a lot of people don't, and we're creating a whole generation of lost boys who are drawn to this red pill stuff, who are drawn to the men's rights movements, who are drawn to the Pepe memes. I mean, this is a whole spectrum of people who have a huge online culture that reinforces itself and reinforces misogyny and stuff. And it's all related. So you can't just say less guns, or you can't say let's just put this kind of receiver on this kind of gun and all of a sudden it's all technically different. That's bullshit. That's not even putting a band-aid on it. That's not even trying. So but these other pieces of shifting culture are much harder to do. There's I'll tell the truth is that I don't have the answer to it. I only have my small piece of it, which is to challenge the dominant gun owning cultures that are around, that are tied to corporate lobbying and that are also tied to patriarchal and misogynist culture. And that's the only piece that I can do as a person that I'm talking about. I don't think it's more education or less education. If more education was going to come in, it really would have to be with leftists to really think about really what, like, instead of just knee jerk and saying we're against guns, we're against shovels, we're against knives, or whatever that we are against. We have to figure out what we are for and then how we integrate that. I want to be very clear. I'm going to talk about mass media, especially like video games and film and
Mhm.
stuff. You know, what is the story that gets told over and over again that you can solve your problems with guns? And that is the first line of defense. I'm not calling for censorship or anything. I think we need to create other films and other narratives that actually challenge that. Is there a way that we could create guns, films and guns where it was much more nuanced and much more serious about that? You know, like it just is a silly example. But I think that these things have to happen. And coming from an anarchist perspective, of course, there's no laws that are going to be written that are going to make it okay for anybody. Nobody. No, not in any side of the debate, because all laws are reactionary, bureaucratic, arbitrary, and selectively enforced, and they mostly target poor people of color. And so they're always going to be that way, right? So if we are able to shift culture though, so I talked about leftist culture, let's talk about conservative and or right culture. And I'm not specifically talking about neo-Nazis and stuff, but let's address the culture that's there. Let's challenge that culture in those spaces where they are, at the gun shows, at the shooting ranges, at the gun shops.
One of the things that anarchist collectives seem to be really good at is outreach to, in particular, the dethroned poor white communities, which it seems to be tied to this rise in mass shootings, because there weren't really mass shootings in this country before the 80s, when we really started to see, like, in particular, the white man for the first time in this country's history be dethroned in that extreme way. And then when your recourse is to grab a gun, if that's the only thing that you're allowed to grab because you're not allowed to have emotions, you're not allowed to feel lonely, like, it seems to be like, well, that's the obvious answer then.
Right, and I think that there's another piece in this, because I want to address the thing about anarchists being able to reach out in these communities. But I want to address another piece here, is that capitalism got hold of gun ecosystems, and so guns became like when I grew up. You had like a 30-06, you might have had like a revolver or something. This is like handed down from your grandfather to you. There is a tradition of that, right? But when you start to introduce what started as M16s, military grade rifles, that became AR-15s, and then they became this object like a sports car or a fashion statement. Many people began to associate, and they're sold as that. If you look at the ads, they're sold as that, and people update them every year, just like they would a car or clothes or something. It's very interesting. So we have to talk about that as a culture also, because it's made an object of desire, right? Not only in mass culture, but in advertising specifically, it's made it very much that. So, so I want to throw that into the field. And so, when you talk about outreach to anarchists being able to reach out, the thing is, the people who are doing that, the John Brown Gun Club, the Huey Newton Gun Club, the groups like Redneck Revolt, the thing is, the reason that they are able to reach out to those groups is because that's who they are. It's not suburban kids, largely, who went to college and did all these things and said, oh, conceptually we should do this. It is because it's their people in their community. But what we have done, this is the beautiful thing that anarchists have done, is created a space that was not dominated by right conservative culture. So Redneck Revolt, John Brown Gun Club, they have been able to reach those people where they are.
Right.
And that's because they're talking to them as neighbors, they're talking to them as church members, they're talking to them as people that they know, not as leftists who or anarchists who know better than they do. They're like, I'll meet you where you're at. And I
Right.
think that that's a really good approach.
So, moving into the book, there seems to be this juxtaposition in the conversations that we have, people that is, about armed self-defense and what Ward Churchill calls in his foreword a strict compliance with the parameters of of dissent permitted by the state. So, what about the space in between? Are there like tactics in between? Are there tactics in between that you feel could really speak to this idea of community self-defense, of justice, and of freedom? Or is it just you either fall in line with what the state wants, which won't help, or you allow yourself to step into this armed self-defense?
No, I think that's what's wonderful about it, is that there's incredible gray area. And let's be clear, in my book, I'm not proposing that everybody carry guns or that we all need to have guns or the guns are the solution by any means. Actually, the book and all the essays that are in there from multiple writers ask the questions. Is this appropriate? How do we not perpetuate same culture with these death machines? And so if I think about it like that, yeah, there's a whole spectrum in between that of like, if, and as an anarchist, I am never going to rely on the state. I do not rely on the police. I do not rely on the military. These are not abstract concepts. This is my real life for the last 25 years of doing this, that I don't rely on them. So if I'm going to do that, then I have to ask, well, who's going to do this? Who's going to do the hard, dirty work? And that's kind of part of how I got there. But the other thing is that I want to be careful about is in leftist culture or radical subcultures or activism that people don't just romanticize the guns. So really what you have now is you actually are starting to begin to see a fight between the First and Second Amendment. The First Amendment being about free speech and the freedom of speech, and the Second Amendment being about the right to carry arms. And so in public spheres, like in protests, which are largely symbolic, you have these two forces now showing up in many places. Like in Texas, it's been happening for about 10 or 15 years. We started to have right wing and militia guys show up. And it can have a chilling effect because if I'm scared, then it will change things. And a mutual journalist friend of ours, Kit O'Connell, filmed me 5 years ago, 6 years ago, talking in the state capitol about the Constitution. And I was talking about how we didn't need the Constitution. It was a constitutional rally, but I was like, how we don't need the Constitution. And these guys with AR-15s all ran to the front. They were a mobbed up militia. And it was the first time I ever felt like I was going to be shot, like literally shot right there. Like I had nobody, nothing, no protection of any kind. And it had a chilling effect. I still continued to talk, but I cut my speech short because of that. So now what you have is you have these Maoist kids showing up in Texas at these protests to armed against these white militias, and you can tell the difference in them because the right wing guys are fully armed, fully carried out. They have military training. There you can tell that they train together, and you have these kids on the other end who look like they just picked up a gun and don't know how to handle it. And so, but I'm afraid they're going to get shot, that they are going to be murdered right in the street because of this. And so we have this tension, and this is a conversation that's not really taken place that I think is really important about gun culture. And this is not about pro or anti, but about where you use it. So from my perspective, I don't care whether people fight over the Constitution or not. What I want us to do is think about when and where we carry arms. Now, an example, the Red Guards are the example I was just talking about here in Austin, Texas, but then you have like the John Brown Gun Club or the Huey Newton Gun Club or the Redneck Revolt, which have all showed up at mass protests with guns in much more appropriate ways, much more information, much more thinking about not really trying to um, look like they're trying to stand off, but actually just say that we are a force also, and we want you to know that we're here. And there's a way to do that, but we are not having these nuances and subtleties in conversation. In fact, this is the first interview where I've ever talked about this stuff, really.
Well, and you touched on something that I wanted to ask about as well, because and you mentioned this in the book as well, like what's important is not to make violence the objective, or to make guns the objective. They are, again, a tool. But how do you stop? Because looking historically, it seems so easy to fall into this cycle where then you just lean back on having the gun, and you just lean back on being violent because it's easier. It's easier than dealing with people and dealing with dissent. Like, how do you think is the best way to avoid falling into something like that?
By not prioritizing guns and challenging dominant gun culture that exists today are two different things. The third piece is that to recognize that are there ways to take up guns collectively for temporary amounts of time that you put them away when you're finished with it? You don't just continue to stand them and become standing armies. The other thing is to recognize that guns in a defensive position, not your private property of your car or your stereo, but in a community-wide defense, where whoever defines themselves as this community says we need to defend ourselves, excuse me, where this community is able to say that those who have guns don't have more power than the people who do not have guns, and that they can be called into question anytime. When you're like, well, where would I see examples of this? Look at the Zapatistas in Chiapas, Mexico. They've been carrying guns for 24 years, but you don't see them with their guns. And they put their guns away publicly in their military formations early on because they wanted to use other ways, but they reserve the right to pull their guns anytime that they can do it. And they also, when the Zapatistas were building, they made sure that they not only had units of women in their military, but they also they challenged the patriarchal gun culture in general, and they said we are only doing this so nobody in the future has to carry guns. Another example would be 1930 Spain, where the Spanish anarchists, millions, 2 million people to 5 million people participated, also took up guns in very small, defensive, autonomous ways in community after community, whether they were rural or cities or block by block. But again, the people who held the guns didn't always keep the guns. They would trade the guns off to other people if they needed to. And it wasn't just men who had guns, and women challenged the patriarchal culture of this. And so these are some examples of that. I think another example would be the way that we carried guns in New Orleans after Hurricane Katrina. We were much smaller scale, and I'm not trying to conflate us with the Zapatistas or the Spanish anarchists on anything, but in our small way, what we did at the Common Ground Collective was that we carried guns, but we carried them very subtly. We didn't photograph ourselves with the guns. We didn't emphasize the guns. The guns were not more important. And this is which brings me to the last piece, which is that defensive thing is only part of building education, food security, and healthcare. It's not anymore. It's just like taking out the garbage or childcare. It's no more or no less important. It has more importance sometimes and has less importance other times. And if we begin to, these would be watershed culture shifts if we were able to adopt these across multiple spectrums. And I'm hoping that this liberatory framework begins to ask those questions, and we begin to do that. And the book is a first step towards that.
In your mind, looking at our current place in time, and particularly with indigenous led, pipeline and resistance camps coming up, do you see guns as being an integral part of that as well, or is it a bit of a different story now?
No, it's definitely important. I mean, the thing is, liberation and collective liberation is on their terms. They decide how they want it to be. Some communities can say, yes, we welcome that in. I mean, the American Indian movement is not gone. It's autonomous and decentralized. There are plenty of people in AIM who still take up guns and still advocate for firearms. The thing is, maybe it wasn't appropriate at Standing Rock, or it's not appropriate at different times, but that's not, there's no one indigenous voice. There's no one indigenous tribe. There's no one indigenous group. So First Nations people can decide how they want to fight on their own terms. The same with any oppressed community that decides that they have a right to determine their own futures the way that they want. And I think the privilege argument, which I've heard not from you, but I've heard it, it's just a red herring argument, because oppressed people have been taking up arms forever. I mean, you think Robert and Mabel Williams, they were like, yeah, we shouldn't do this. I mean, they probably did think about it, but they still did it anyway. The Deacons for Self-Defense still did. These are just U.S. examples. There was black men who were considered gangsters, not by me, but by quote unquote civil society, by the law enforcement, who took up arms after Hurricane Katrina to defend their own communities. These guys had so much to lose. Sunsir Shakur, who wrote a story in that book, he came from Washington, D.C. as a black man and took up arms in a black community. I mean, he was facing triple anything that I was facing. I got put face down on the ground multiple times by law enforcement to be killed, but they didn't shoot, they didn't pull the trigger. As many times they pushed the gun to my forehead or in the back of my head, they never pulled the trigger. Whereas with Sunsir, they could have pulled the trigger in 2 seconds and never thought about it and just walked on. So yeah, I think about that, but I think we have to be careful about not framing it as privileged versus non-privileged, because the most exploited people have agency to do what they want to do to determine their own futures, and I am not going to tell them what to use or what not to use. But those on the outside with privilege, just in using any tool or tactic or anything that we're doing in support of communities, we have to ask them first. The Zapatistas lead by obeying. Ask them, what do you need? How is it you can do that?
And one of the things that you do talk about is, in particular, like the Huey P. Newton Gun Club and Black Panthers come up a lot, and knowing what happened to them because of COINTELPRO and how the government just completely, like, tried to obliterate them. It, in this current, surveillance Big Brother state that we are currently living in, and it's only getting worse. What sort of steps in taking up arms would you recommend to people in this current state?
Well, the way that I have always approached it is that you don't brag about it, you don't photograph yourself a lot with it, and You don't promote it as the thing, and you don't show up everywhere with it. You can build capacity, which we did in anti-racist action. We built capacity across a network that nobody knew about. The right wing did not know about it. The state may have known about it to degrees, but according to my FBI documents, they didn't know about it. And so I'm saying that I think there's ways to do that. Like we need groups like John Brown Gun Club or the Huey Newton Gun Club to actually push it to the envelope, because I think they're very responsible in the way that they do it and the way that they choose to do it. And what we need less of is communist groups and Maoist groups who are trying to make a show of it and not without any safety. And so I think my advice is to build capacity. If you're going to do this, build capacity. Again, not the center of your group. If you make it the central part of your group, you should disband automatically. But if it's a key part of your group as part of other things that you don't have to show everybody. You don't have to brag about it. You don't have to show everybody that you can shoot a gun.
This issue of purity, and it's something that was brought up in Simone Cedillo's piece on the cartels in Mexico. Um, I see that coming up here, not just with like the, oh, I'm completely anti-gun or I'm completely pro-gun, but also in terms of what that means. Like, would you stand next to a registered Republican on like the front lines if you needed to? Would you engage in community self-defense with a new age libertarian? Like, what does that issue of purity look like?
I took up arms in New Orleans. Two white guys from Texas and three guys from the neighborhood there first took up arms. One of them was a gangster. One of them was a preacher. I'm not into religion at all. I'm an atheist. But what am I going to battle with this person right now, like ideologically about things? Sure, there's going to in community defense of any kind, whether it's armed or not, you're going to have a mix of people because it depends on what you define your community by, right? Like, is it only anarchists? Well, sure, you're probably going to be more on the same page on things. Probably, maybe not. Or is it queer culture? That's a broad subculture. Is it hip hop culture? What is it that you self identify? Is it your geography? Is it your ethnicity? Is it where you're born? All of these things that are kind of crossover into culture, we have to think about. I don't think guns change that, except if you only look at it in single issue.
What are you hoping that people get from the wide swath of stories that you've incorporated into this book? What are you hoping that people glean from it?
There's actually three things. One, that we begin to create a liberatory approach to gun culture. So, a liberatory community armed self-defense, which challenges all the notions of self-defense or armed struggle on the left or the right or any of the traditional ways that we have done it. So that's number one. The second thing is it's directed towards people who on the left specifically who aren't steeped in gun culture at all, who may want to take up arms so that they don't do stupid things and they don't hurt themselves. It's not a how-to manual, but like, hey, think about this for a minute. And then the third one is I really would like this book to reach right wingers. I would like it to reach libertarians, big L libertarians, people outside of that to understand that there is a culture that comes from quote unquote leftist traditions that is more in agreement and makes us less different than they are in some ways. And again, this is not because we have to get along on everything, but that we can begin to have nuanced conversations to look at this thing that my friend Sue Hildebrand calls the totem, this gun, the totem, and then we begin to actually have these more nuanced conversations around it, and that address health issues, and mental health issues, that address food security, education, all the things, the inequalities that are there, that they become wrapped up in this liberatory culture. So again, that's the three audiences and the premise of what I'm trying to get. And then four, I guess, would be to recognize that there are real costs in this. The reason I chose first person narratives is because I wanted people to give you their reflections. Ashanti Alston is one of the pieces. He was in the Black Liberation. I mean, he was in the Black Panther Party at 16. At 19, he was in the Black Liberation Army. At 21, he was a political prisoner for 15 years. And he has post traumatic stress from it. He deals with it daily. He's in his 60s now. He deals with it daily. I deal with the violence that happened in New Orleans. It's been now, whatever long has it been, 12, 13 years. I still deal with it. Like far less than I did because I went to a lot of therapy, but it's still real. And so I wanted the first person narratives to make these stories real, not so people would be scared, but so they can understand the consequences that are there, but also the liberatory openings that are possibly there too.
And that, I know I said finally, but that
No,
just
go, man.
prompted
Go,
one
go.
more question.
No, go, go.
Um, because this is something that I had a conversation with Iraq Veterans Against War, who say that people throw around this word revolution, and they want a revolution, but they don't understand what it's like to drag your friend's dead body out of the street. And until you recognize what that is, then you shouldn't walk around talking about this armed revolution. Would you say that and it seems like in your book too, there is that very powerful, like, this is what happened to us, but this is, we're not bragging about what we did, but we only did it because we had nothing else to do. Would you say that it's kind of the same thing? Like, you need to take those people down a notch that are talking about, like, yeah, revolution against the largest military the world's ever seen.
Yeah, because it's folly. It's totally romanticism, and we have to have romantics. We have to dream about things. That's important. But the thing is, holding people like Che Guevara in high regard without any context, this doesn't help anybody. Romanticizing the gun will get us back into the same positions we were in the 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s with guns, and it doesn't challenge it. So again, the book is, I hope, is proposing this other way of looking at it, where we don't romanticize it, but we say that there are some dreams, and we want this might be helpful towards getting towards those dreams, but they're not the answer to getting towards those dreams.